Hello, and welcome to lesson 4 of Preparing Your Dog for New Baby. This lesson, we're going to focus on baby development and how it impacts your dog. So let's get into it. The first thing that I wanted to start with today is for those of you who are taking this class that are adopting a baby. Some of you may not know exactly how old your baby will be when you bring him or her home. So in my case, when my son was adopted from Guatemala, we visited him between the age of 7 and 8 weeks. And then our paperwork sat on some random guy's desk for a couple of months after that. And we didn't get to bring Ari home until he was about 5 months old. I was prepared for a younger baby because that is what was happening at the time. Some of you may end up with a toddler. Some of you may end up with a newborn. So you need to kind of think ahead a little bit and do the best you can in getting your dog ready for a baby who may not be a newborn, but who may be a little bit more developmentally advanced. Those of you that are pregnant, of course, know how old your baby will be when it comes home. And for you, it's a little bit more predictable in terms of the developmental stages that your newborn baby will be in when your dog starts to interact with your child. So in the materials section of this class, I have a much larger version of this infographic that I created for you about how your baby's development impacts your dog. And I want to go through some of the stages with you because they're going to be really important, particularly if your dog is very sensitive and concerned with sudden movements or sudden noises. So babies tend to not be very problematic for your dog because they don't move around very much. They're not very threatening. However, for dogs that are quite sensitive, then they may find the baby's presence somewhat offensive because they will be spontaneously loud. They'll start to cry. Sometimes they'll cry for a really long time. And the dog may need some relief from that level of noise. And so, again, understanding dog body language is going to help you figure out how the noise and movements that your new baby is making is impacting your dog, and what kind of relief you may need to provide, which might mean moving your dog to another room or behind a gate, or give your dog something to do so the dog is less worried that the baby seems like it's in distress. So some dogs that are very nurturing get worried because they think something's wrong with the baby, even though the baby is just sort of learning how to exist in the world. And there's a lot of big changes and sort of stimulus processing that your baby needs to do. The evenings tend to be the hardest. Babies are processing their whole day, and it's just kind of a lot to deal with and take in because every single thing in their life is new. And so oftentimes you get more crying in the late afternoons and evenings into the night. So we want to talk about how the baby's development may impact your dog. And this is going to include some sudden movements. We call these a startle response. So a lot of babies may be, resting or swaddled or, quiet. And all of a sudden they do this. They just suddenly arms and legs go straight out. And for some dogs, that's very concerning and alarming. If your baby is totally swaddled, I was never very good at that myself, but I know now there are new products that help you do it with Velcro and stuff. But when I had my kids little, we just used receiving blankets, and I was terrible at wrapping up the babies. But when they're wrapped up, they're less likely to have that kind of startle response, but it is something to be aware of. Now, as your baby starts to get a little bit older, closer to 2 months, 3 months, they're going to be lifting their head a little bit more. They're going to be starting to stare more into the face of their caregivers. This is when your baby is going to start to slowly notice that the dog exists. Another thing to think about is these involuntary, grasping, responses. These are involuntary. And if your dog's tail or fur happen to get in the way, your baby can grab onto those. So it's something to be aware of. As your baby gets a little bit older, they'll be intentionally reaching for objects, including toys, but it could be reaching towards your dog. This is a good time to start realizing that your behavior is something that your child is watching, and they're going to do what you do. So for example, if you are up in your dog's face and, ooh, would, I love you, I'm going to kiss you and snuggle you, then the baby thinks that that's okay to do as well. So you need to start to realize that you are being watched all the time, and the baby will mimic what you do. So be gentle with the dog. Make sure that you start using language that implies that the child needs to be gentle with the dog as well. Babies will start to use their legs and arms to support their body, and they'll push up and tip over and push up and tip over. Some will start to roll over, and this can be concerning for certain dogs, particularly if they're laying down together. We want to make sure that the dog is rewarded for moving away from the baby instead of staying there and being uncomfortable. Your baby is going to start to recognize faces and names and basic sort of language. They're going to be doing babbling noises, which may impact your dog. It may not. It's going to depend on your dog. Again, how you react to your dog may impact whether your dog becomes, or your baby becomes, what we call magnetized to your dog. So if every time you see a dog, you're like, "Ooh, doggy, yay, this is so cute," then your baby is going to be more and more excited about dogs. And we'd rather your baby just not care that much about dogs. We like that they like our dogs, obviously, but we don't want to turn the dog into something that the baby always wants to interact with, because for a while, safety is going to be a giant issue, like until they're 10 years old, probably. Okay. When they get a little bit older, they're going to start to sit up unsupported, passing objects from hand to hand, peekaboo games. These things are all going to be really fun, but movement is really going to get going. So your baby is going to start crawling and scooching, whether they crawl regularly or they do what my kids did, which was this commando crawl where they lay on their belly and kind of drag themselves around. They're going to want to go see the dog. We need to make sure that barriers are in place, that your dog is never trapped, feels like there's no escape, because that's when we start to see growls and bites. And this is when I get called a lot, is when the baby goes from being stable and one position to starting to move around the house as it moves towards the dog's bed, towards the dog's toys, towards the dog's meals. These are really big concerns, and we want to make sure that your dog is totally supported and is feeling super safe. You're noticing body language as well so that you can intervene. But this is where gates and barriers and pens and crates and all these things where you rotate are valuable. Again, you have to be careful how you react. If your baby starts to crawl towards your dog and you run up and go, no, then you're telling your dog the baby is something to be worried about, and that's going to create a problem. We also don't want your baby to become afraid of the dog, because with that kind of extreme emotional reaction, your baby's going to think, oh God, the dog is something I shouldn't be near, kind of like a hot stove or whatever. So we really need to be careful how we react at times like this. When your kiddo starts to walk, and actually, let's go back a little bit. When your baby starts to sit up, they're staring out ahead. This is when some of that body language and how humans and dogs communicate differently can become problematic. So if you're staring, if a baby is staring at the dog may perceive that as a challenge and may become really uncomfortable. You may begin to see things like the dog looking away, trying to say, I'm not a threat. The dog may do a paw lift, start to lick its lips. You may see whale eye, or if your dog is relaxed and the baby starts to stare, then you may see the dog's jaw close tight and start to see facial tension. All of these things are things that you need to intervene with immediately. Then when you've got a walking, running, toddling, falling down little creature on your hands, then life is very unpredictable, because you never know what the toddler is going to do next, and neither does your dog. So this is a time to really use management a lot to your advantage so that we can really, really help our dogs feel safe. Now, your baby in so many cases is going to go through these, phases of, like this one here, totally wrapped up, will be gazing into your eyes, not very threatening to a dog, just noisy, This little baby here is starting to be much more aware of the world, able to grab objects, starting to kick. Some of that is involuntary. We want to make sure the dog isn't being pummeled by baby feet, although this is not an intentional thing on the baby's part. The baby's not trying to hurt your dog. The baby is just growing muscles and learning how to move its body. But again, the baby is able to grab the dog at this point. We want to be really careful. And then as the baby gets a little bit older and wants to pull up or start holding onto things and jumping up and down over and over and over again, this is where we really have to be careful, because this dog is definitely uncomfortable. The baby is using the dog for balance, and that's not appropriate. That's not what the dog's job or purpose is. Now, the other thing at this stage is that there are lots of spaces in your home that start to become troublesome. Narrow doorways, narrow hallways, the narrow space between the sofa and the coffee table. We tend to get individuals who congregate in these places, and the baby likes to pull up on the couch or likes to pull up on the coffee table. But if the dog is there, the dog may feel trapped and unable to escape. We need to make sure we teach the dog to leave, or you call them away. I would also encourage you, again, to use barriers and baby gates and things to ensure that these kinds of crowding issues don't happen. Now, this is a common time when I go to people's homes or when I do consults over video with families that I start to help them rearrange their furniture. I'm not kidding, where I say, okay, I love how you have this decorated. I know it's beautiful and it's super nice. However, this spot is tricky and dangerous. So what I need you to do is move your coffee table this way instead of this way. And I need you to push it out this far, because we need bigger pathways for our kids and dogs to walk through. Okay, so we want to make sure that these crowded places are not problematic for your dog and your baby, because that could result in something tricky and dangerous later on. All right, now I'm going to give you sort of this activity to work on, where I want you to try to identify how your dog is going to react to different developmental stages. Now, obviously, if your baby's not born yet, you may not know how to answer these questions. I totally get that. There are apps that you can download for your phone. I think there's one called Pup School. Let me check actually while I'm right here. Pull up my phone and check. I've got a little dog section on my phone. Yes, it's called Pup School, and it looks like this. And it's a great app. I will link to it for you in this lesson so that you can get more information about it. What's fun about this app is it's a variety of different sounds that you can play for your dog before your baby is born, including baby crying noises and other things like that, where you can see how your dog responds to that sort of thing. Now, we've mentioned before that just because your dog hears a baby crying or a toddler tantruming doesn't mean that it will react the same way to your baby doing those same things. Your baby has its own voice, and it may impact the dog differently. The dog is going to have some feelings about your baby more so than they will about a baby sound in an app where it's not as emotional, but it's still telling, right? If the dog freaks out about it, then we need to really start working on it. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to pair the sound of the baby with treats. So we would play the sound on the app very quietly at start. Give the dog treats when you hear the sound. When the dog is totally relaxed, you can increase the volume. Again, continue the treats until the dog is very relaxed around this sound. For certain dogs, they're so sensitive, you need to put the phone like on the opposite side of the room and have a farther distance. Remember, your dog is going to be more and more comfortable the farther they are away from what we would call a trigger. So in this case, though, I want you to think about, how will your dog respond to sudden movement? So you could even be super silly and lay on the floor, and out of nowhere, you could have a startle response, and see what your dog does, right? You can start to pull on your dog's ears and tail and see how they respond to that. Now, you need to remember that you've had a lifetime of relationship building with your dog, and so they may react to you doing things differently than they would to a child. but it is interesting to see what they're tolerant of and what they're not. Now, I need to say that just because your dog is tolerant of something doesn't mean they're happy, right? So you may want your dog to be tolerant of having their tail pulled, but it's not very polite to require that to happen to your dog, right? I would rather your dog's tail not be pulled, but you should know what would happen if it was, so that you can, like, if your dog is going to turn around with very little warning and chomp on somebody, you have to know that right away, because then you're not going to ever allow that to happen. I don't think you should allow it to happen anyway, but it is important to know the level of how your dog feels. How tolerant is your dog? How patient is your dog? So how tolerant would your dog be if somebody jumping around? Because babies like to bounce, right? What about staring at your dog? These kinds of things. I am curious how your dog may respond to these things. And I also want you to have a management plan in place. So like everything with this class, I want you to have plans. If you have plans, your anxiety will go down and you have less things to worry about. So where are you going to put the dog if the baby is crying for hours? What are you going to do with your dog if you start to see the baby crawling towards the dog? What is your plan B when this thing starts to happen? Okay. These plans are crucial. Okay. So this is part of it. And, like I gave you a plan for it assignment earlier, I'm going to ask you to really think about that here. As your baby starts to grow and is reaching towards toys, these are examples of behaviors that will impact your dog. You should also know how your dog behaves to a swinging motion. If your dog is in a swing or a bouncy seat, if you have a herding breed dog, these are things you definitely need to be aware of. And I would encourage the dog not to have access to your baby in a time like that. If your dog is really worried about food, or if they're extra possessive about meals or toys, we need to be very careful about meal times. If your baby gets messy when they're eating, and the dog wants to lick the food off the baby, it looks really sweet and adorable. But if your dog gets angry, if you reach in to protect your baby or to move the baby, then you can have a bite situation. So you need, again, to really know what your dog thinks and feels, and the body language knowledge that you will develop over the course of this class and doing your homework will really make a significant difference here. All right. Your baby may not be born yet, in which case this assignment does not apply to you. But if you do have a baby, I would love for you to research the developmental stage that's correlated with where your baby is currently, right? Now, remember, all of these developmental stages are generalizations. They're not necessarily specific to your child. Some children have developmental delays, and that's totally fine. So just pay attention to your baby. What kinds of stages is your baby going through, and how can those stages pose challenges for your dog, right? Please don't be disappointed or upset if, well, most babies are walking by now, or most babies are rolling by now. It's going to happen eventually, right? So just be kind, be patient. All of these steps happen in due time. If your child has any physical limitations, we'll work with those as well. And again, just so you know, I am available if you need some more support and personal coaching and, customized consults and support based on your unique family and your situation. I hope you found this helpful. See you next time.